Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yusta, Simona, Maya, and everyone who's here for making time to come today. So yeah, really great. Yeah, apologies for my if I sneeze in the middle of the talk. So that's the title, and unfortunately my PowerPoint got corrupted, so that's all you're going to see visually. So you better get used to it. So, of course, also if anything isn't clear, we'll also speak about it in the question part, and of course it will be hopefully clarified in the text. So, to talk about this division in a way, or before I even talk about division, these two kind of tendencies related to affect and a kind of emphasis on rationality or rationalism in contemporary theory, I guess I want to think about how they're often talked about as being more or less sort of sufficient unto themselves on either side, or kind of mutually exclusive for that reason. So I would also want to think about why they're separated the way, or why they get separated the way they get separated, and I want to think maybe not to call like the basis for their separation something like affect related or affective, but I want to think about it in terms of pathos or pathos form, which is why I'm using that term. And it's a neologism which I sort of came up with, related to the art historian Aby Warburg, who talked about the Pathos Formula. And maybe some of you have studied that if you're in art history. So the Pathos Formula in Aby Warburg is a kind of emotionally charged or significant visual trope or gesture that occurs in different modes of graphic representation across history. Paintings, woodcuts, sculpture, newspapers, internet, lolcats. But incorporating the idea of the pathos form that I wanted to think about starts out from there, but incorporates the dimension of value form, which is a term in contemporary Marxist theory that talks about, which refers to the logic of capitalist exchange mediated by money, as it organizes social and political relations from labor to education to intimacy through modalities of power and exploitation, both direct and indirect. So thus I want to combine this kind of very sort of logical or general understanding of form in this idea of value form with the aesthetic understanding from Aby Warburg, and combine them in order to read pathos as a kind of category of diagnosis and analysis for this kind of, both for the present more generally, but specifically here for this division between affect and reason in contemporary theory. So to read pathos in its articulations of being a hegemonic affect and a hegemony of affect in a specific historical moment. So it's a way of thinking about what Lauren Berlant calls the historical present, and also using affect to think about history in the sense of moods, sentiments, attunements, which characterize a particular historical epoch. So examples of those moods or sentiments could be relations of subjectivity to power or to economic rationality, and how they affect one another. So for this talk, I'd like to think about, as already mentioned, some current trends in contemporary theory, art theory, and political discourse as it absorbs the influence of these pathos forms. So affect, rationalism, and the different kinds of new materialisms that come out of them. So quite often, both affect and rationality are talked about as sort of polarized and incompatible modes of thought, or seen as mutually exclusive critical approaches, or often also post-critical approaches. So affect seems to be more dominant as a theoretical trend and as a political category in the academy and the art world, Although rationalism also, for example, there's a new reader called Realism, Materialism, and Art, which is a good introduction perhaps to how rationalism is infiltrating art discourse, coming out of speculative realism. I'll say more about that later. Rationalism is also gaining ground, especially in art critical discourse, due to its closeness to object-oriented and speculative realist type paradigms. So to think about how affect and reason or affect and rationality get approached in these discussions raises the question of positivism. So I'm using positivism to talk about, like, positivism refers basically to the idea that knowledge is self-sufficient and it's pointless to inquire into its conditions of production. There's a kind of one-to-one correspondence between knowledge and its objects. So positivism is a term that was very much advanced by critical theory in the humanities in the 20th century, persisting into post-structuralism and deconstruction, and critical paradigms including psychoanalysis, post-colonial, decolonial, critical race, feminism, queer theory. All of these kind of would range themselves against sort of like what they would call positivism, or the simplistic approach of positivism. And all these approaches, of course, had some impact on almost every humanities and social science discipline somewhere along the line, even if they didn't ally themselves with the kind of Marxian or Frankfurt School critical theory project. They were all sort of very suspicious of a kind of, positivism. So it was roughly the role of the humanities in this scenario. It was the role of the humanities to be critical, and the empirical sciences to be what was called value-free, so just describing facts and not talking about the conditions for those facts. And that's, again, a sort of indication of a positivist approach to knowledge. And so the idea of science being value-free, in critical theory would define that as ideological in the sense that it's not aware of its own bias and thinks of itself as neutral. So in the late 20th century, critical paradigm would often separate off humanities and empirical sciences in that way. And then science and technology studies, or things like actor network theory, all came out of a desire to make science more reflexive and less kind of positivist in the way I've just been describing, to kind of analyze its kind of constitution and from a sociological and theoretical perspective. So I guess what I'd like to think about is whether this sort of separation of affect and reason, or affect theory and rationalism as analytic approaches, whether those two in themselves can we think of them as positivistic or as part of a positivist program, insofar as they legitimate their claims, not just saying that they're self-sufficient on either side and they don't need one another, but they legitimate their claims by reference to what is called hard science or neuroscience, usually. In different ways, of course. So to be more precise about those different ways, affect theory and the notion of reason, which is valorized in the speculative realism as opposed tendencies, are in a way, have a common project, even if they wouldn't acknowledge it, have a common project insofar as they reference scientific phenomena, mostly neurology, or a kind of very sort of monolithic concept of hard science, in order to make their truth claims, very pointedly, as opposed to making those truth claims depend on social or historical institutions or analysis. So from the perspective of critical theory, this reference to science looks pre-critical, I guess, in its sort of reification, or kind of making into an object, I guess, reification of the social as natural, as ultimately explicable through reference to natural or scientific phenomena on the one hand, and the kind of dualism between I guess, nature and culture, affect and reason, which comes out of this kind of analysis. So why is there this division? What kind of cultural logic does this kind of division represent? Which is to say, what are the kind of larger structural, perhaps, explanations for it, both like in terms of social possibility, social phenomena, but also political desire, in a situation where political desire and sort of social change seem blocked from a lot of directions. So in order to think, if you're thinking about desire as a way of analyzing or explaining this kind of division between affect and reason, it might seem like there's already a choice to look to affect as an explanatory principle, which confirms affect in its legitimacy as a paradigm. So if the desire for affect and the desire for the rational can both be shown to be desires which come out of a sense of enclosure, perhaps, or a sense of blockage. So in a way, these desires seem to be more performative or reacting to something as much, if not more, than they're proposing something or defending something, even if that's what it seems like they're doing. So to avoid the risk of kind of collapsing a sort of inquiry into what desire drives the separation into an inquiry simply into affect, I guess we have to maintain a distinction, an analytic distinction, a critical distinction between affect and desire. So, and at the same time, rationality should not be rejected in a kind of absolute or reified, that is, objectifying way, even if in its own terms it does use those kinds of objectifying methods. So my general argument really is not to kind of see theoretical things as separate, but how, as separate or as self-sufficient, but how thinking of things hides the relations that make this thinking possible or actual at a given historical moment. So I pose the question again after going through those points. Where does the division between affect and rationality in contemporary theory in general come from? So on the side of perhaps what you're familiar with as speculative realism or speculative materialism, there's a need, it comes from a need that is felt for a corrective or for correcting what has been perceived as a dominance of linguistic and semiotic approaches in the humanities over recent decades. So I guess in terms borrowing from the sort of financial language, it's a desire for something like a underlying to ground the derivatives of the theory market, something in any case more substantial than just referring to the social, which is most common in linguistic and semiotic approaches to theory. So there's a kind of element of a desire for authenticity to this recentering from the social to the natural or the scientific. Or in terms of Alain Badiou, a kind of passion for the real. But unlike in the way Badiou talks about that, this is a real which actually bypasses politics and aims straight at a kind of non-negotiable principle for life or intelligence as a framework for human and non-human agency, depending which side of affect rationality you situate your inquiry. So the solidity of this real is importantly also seen as a source for potential change. So whether it's the kind of immersive space of performative, non-cognitive, and even pre-emotional forces which affect theory talks about, or the analytic constructivism of neo-rationalism, both reason or affect as seen as the sort of what defines the human capacity for change, even like at a molecular level, not even yet social change. So one example on the side of sort of neo-rationalism, so to speak, is the philosopher Reza Negarestani has been developing in platforms including eFlux. Well, that's where I've come across them anyway. Reza Nagarstani has been developing a concept of rationalist universalism, which sort of refurbished for the era of artificial intelligence, as if we think about algorithms as definitive of this era of artificial intelligence. There's, of course, been previous eras of artificial intelligence. So the way he formulates this project is a kind of, is in terms of kind of the Enlightenment, of kind of debunking and sort of dismantling orthodoxies in theory, orthodoxies in the humanities, orthodoxies in politics, and it's a kind of very much sort of exposing Enlightenment type of project, or type of tone to the project. So if you think of, I mean, you can even compare it to someone like Richard Dawkins, like kind of militant atheism, a sort of very sort of absolutist skepticism. And Nagarstani ranges his project not only against something like the evident irrationalism of faith or religion, as Dawkins would, but what he sees as kind of more critically underdeveloped philosophical and political projects, which for him includes Marxism, or what he calls kitsch Marxism. And of course, this is a kind of, in some ways, a classical positivist move, where the kind of proposition is, if theory can't keep up with reality, then reality needs to be the master of theory. So Nagarstani writes, for example, quote, "It's no secret that the bulk of contemporary socio-political prescriptions are based on a conception of humanity that has failed to synchronize itself with modern science, or to take into account social and organizational alterations effected by technological forces," end quote. So for him, sense and sensibility, in a way, so what he calls sapience and sentience, or kind of, I guess, affect and reason, you could say, are totally distinct. And the historical project of humanity is on the side of reason, intelligence, cognition, and is not particularly related to the other side. And this is, in a way, a set of commitments which recurs in different ways across the speculative realist spectrum of thinking. So this idea of enlightenment and kind of being pro-enlightenment, and you see those kinds of polemics in the work of Quentin Meillassoux or Ray Brassier as well, amongst many others. So here, reason is a kind of byword or code word for control over human destiny, not merely at a social or personal, but at a cosmic scale. And the irrationalism, what gets called the irrationalism of philosophical perspectives like phenomenology, structuralism, for this thinking also represents a political conservatism. They see it as a kind of reactionary endorsement of the status quo by philosophy, that there is a kind of limit or kind of human finitude is seen as a sort of reactionary dogma, which is profoundly anti-enlightenment and somehow religious, or certainly not concerned with the changeability of the human. So this dichotomy between kind of reason and sense, reason and affect, that you see in these kinds of speculative projects within philosophy, or neo-rationalist projects within philosophy, is reproduced very much also in people who embrace the tag of accelerationism, which has kind of considers itself, or has been considered, the political wing, in a way, of speculative realism. And there's even like a kind of further discussion within that of Promethean Ism. I don't know how many of you have come across this term. Prometheanism refers to the kind of tragic species destiny of humanity to unleash progress rather than be bound by convention, prejudice, or what gets called in accelerationism folk politics, which means basically it's a kind of accelerationist jargon for the local, the ethical, and the different as the ground of political agency or political organization. And the idea of calling it folk also comes from folk psychology, which is a kind of condescending term used primarily in kind of cognitivist or analytic philosophy more generally, for how things seem to non-philosophers. So folk politics is like how things seem to people who don't have a grasp of the big picture that accelerationists do. So here, universalism, like reason before, universalism is a kind of code word or byword for the unifying role of reason across different forms of life and social formations, a kind of theory of human existence and ontology, a kind of practical ontology of exceptionalism. But the exceptionalism is not for the human species, but for something understood more broadly as intelligence. So this ties humanity, insofar as humanity practices this sort of transformative agency of intelligence, it ties humanity to technologically evolved cognition, such as artificial intelligence or beings who might develop artificial intelligence, through this idea of reason as a programming faculty, a kind of generic programming faculty, rather than through animality or through kind of the animal, the dimension of the animal through sense or the generic kind of common sense of sensation. So there's a kind of generic sense on one, common sense or sort of sensibility, sensation on one side, and the generic faculty of reason on the other, and it's only the latter which properly defines the human. So these kinds of distinctions are kind of familiar to us from Descartes. They're very Cartesian distinctions between mind and body, in a way. And they're familiar from philosophy, but they're also a familiar object of critique more generally as being part of a capitalist and imperial project of modernity. But it's a project which, like modernity in general, like taking for a moment perhaps the perspective of the neo-rationalists, has always had a kind of buried radical tradition of enlightenment as emancipation, which can be somehow separated from enlightenment as domination. And those consequences of the emancipatory consequences and dimensions of the Enlightenment are those which are, sort of largely repressed from the 18th century up into the present, according to the neo-rationalists. So even if we think of the dialectic of enlightenment, which was proposed by Adorno and Horkheimer in the 40s, that the enlightenment is always sort of has a rupture at its center, where reason becomes unreason through its desire to dominate nature, human and non-human. So the return to this kind of rationalist discourse in the project of speculative realisms, materialisms, or even just basically speculative rationalism can also be seen from a maybe slightly more kind of zooming out from its philosophical particulars and philosophical histories, can even be seen something like a swing of theoretical fashion back to a kind of 1990s cyberfuturism, much as the 90s have come back in other aspects of material culture, like fashion and design, for example. So particularly it owes a lot, both kind of culturally and theoretically, to the work of Nick Land, 1990s cyber dystopian philosopher turned 2000s racist blogger, whose legacy is rather incompletely repurposed by the accelerationist theorists. But his main contribution, which is pretty much the core of accelerationism, is that you can only get out of capitalism by being more capitalist, so accelerating the contradictions that will break down capitalism, except that is maybe an addition that accelerationists have put on it, whereas Land wasn't particularly interested in getting beyond capitalism, but only in accelerating. And the kind of space of intensity of acceleration. So it's hard, but it's actually hard to see how these kinds of frozen oppositions or reified oppositions between affect and reason operate in this register of rationalism, unless you also look at affect theory on the other side, which also is committed to to naturalism, or kind of referring to science to define its claims, to legitimate its claims. But it's coming from a kind of much more post-structuralist place. So as I already mentioned, affect is much more established, affect theory rather, is much more established in the academy and across the humanities and social science disciplines than neo-rationalism. So affect theory, I guess, is developed predominantly or primarily by figures like Brian Massumi, Patricia Tintinetto-Clow, Eve Sedgwick, Sarah Ahmed, and Cvetkovic or Lauren Berlant, amongst some others. And they're quite sort of central and unavoidable in the Anglophone curriculum and beyond, especially in cultural theory, also in art criticism, especially as affect theory doesn't kind of limit the disciplinary reach of the work of these researchers and thinkers, which takes in areas like philosophy, psychoanalysis, queer theory, comparative literature, and performance studies. So what defines, I guess, affect theory is a kind of overt focus on feeling within public culture, within history, within aesthetics, and the political on the one hand, and then kind of neuroscientific bent towards the non-conscious dynamics which frame subjectivity and sociality on the other hand. So, but it's quite a diverse spectrum. So someone like Lauren Berlant is on the more kind of Marxian critical theory side, and someone like Brian Massumi is on the more kind of neuroscience, kind of vitalist, Deleuzian side. So in a way we can propose that both affect theory and the new rationalisms are, in some sense, post-critical enunciations of what remain projects of critique in some way. So what does that mean, that they're post-critical projects of critique? So if neo-rationalism that you find in speculative realism, speculative materialism, wants to correct the course of theory from an emphasis on signification and culture to properly reckoning with like neuroscientific facts, so to speak, which underlie our ability to mobilize thought, to order and organize and transform planetary existence. The way affect theory wants to correct the course of theory is to move from a critique based on empirical and social knowledge to critique predicated on feeling, or to maybe alter the relationship between knowledge and feeling. So the kind of nebulous, chaotic, lively is actually found at the heart of science, at the heart of technoscience, by affect theory. But this chaotic circulation of affect doesn't get located as within a human subject, necessarily, which can be used to like talk about a sort of theory of being through affect. It's kind of displaces the human subject from the center of the analysis in a way, the same as rationalism does, but very, very differently. But also you can see that the question animating both of them seems to be one of a kind of political desire for, within theory, a kind of search for theory to be more effective or more descriptive of the real, for theory to have a purpose that it needs to discover outside itself, outside its own vocabulary, outside its own frame of reference. And to find this purpose in some kind of master discourse, perhaps, like science, like technology, which can be exempted from critique, from the critique that a discursive project would continue mobilizing against that reliance on a master discourse. So in a way, regardless of kind of decades of science sociologies and like critiques of that kind of approach to science, also from within science, or even people like Donna Haraway and other critical scholars of science, for both affect and affect theory and neo-rationalism, this master discourse is normatively science. So as Suhail Malik and Armin Avanesian write in their anthology that they've edited this year, come out this year, Genealogies of Speculation, Materialism and Subjectivity Since Structuralism. They talk about the schematic, they quote the schematic discrepancies and adversarial stances, so kind of, I guess, false oppositions, they mean, which characterize not just the reception of speculative realist and materialist discourses in the academy, but the kind of internal struggles within each side of them. And they see this as kind of going against the pursuit of research programs and rather more kind of a symptom of the conditions of reproduction of academia itself, where research programs are established somewhere between kind of competing for positions and the search for distinction and for novelty as the main way that you perform politics in the academy. So they imply that this kind of rift between the new sort of rationalisms or new realisms and post-structuralism can be overcome, can be healed, which I think is a very valuable consideration. That we can acknowledge, but still ask how it is that affect versus reason could ever come to pose as a kind of serious binary within academia that people can fight over. And I guess I've been suggesting that the way they can establish themselves like that only because both of the orientations on both sides share a basic commitment. They share a basic commitment to, so if they didn't have something in common, they wouldn't have anything to fight about. They both share a commitment to this neuropositivism or positivism of science, which frames the debate between those who advocate non-cognition and affect on the one hand and rational thought on the other. But this becomes kind of a distraction because both of them are bracketing the social, the historical, and the economic, both in their analytic object, but also in the conditions of their own production as discourses. So although affect theorists often have socio-critical agendas in their work, in their research projects, meaning this kind of positivism tends to fade into the background, we can also see on a kind of zooming out, on a kind of macro scale, how kind of important fields with neuro or cognitive in their title have become in academia and how much funding they attract, how much kind of recognition they get. And there we can actually see that it's very rational to work with feelings, at least economically. So, but perhaps these kinds of naturalized theories about feeling, kind of naturalized through science, can actually be more interesting to think about outside these academic debates and rather in the landscape of political dispositions and positions. So the sort of visibility and the truth of feeling is affirmed pretty widely, pretty generally, from this kind of across lots of formations. Some examples would be like the project, the feel tank, as opposed to the think tank, which is formed by the queer and critical theorists in Chicago, including Lauren Berland, or the kind of all the discussions about the importance of fantasy and dream, everything from the Obama campaign to Stephen Duncombe's book, Dream, Reimagining Progressive Politics in the Age of Fantasy. So the importance for leftist progressive politics, not just to focus their critique on in terms of reason, but in terms of desire and fantasy. At the same time, the performance of affect as the baseline for any political claims or any political positions is very pervasive also in social media, where political feelings kind of are constantly crowding and competing with one another on Twitter and Facebook, and can be seen all over the place as definitions of a self-image, as well as a stance within a community and the definition of communities. So this conjunction in social media, you have a kind of conjunction of affect and algorithm, And that seems to dominate the platforms of social expression and how they're constructed, no less than the kinds of expressions that are performed within them. So for that, you can think about the sort of outcry when Facebook secretly modified its newsfeed to show more depressing content, which was a kind of scientific trial, but they didn't inform their customers about that, obviously, because that would have affected the results. So even if recently, in the last few decades, maybe in the 80s, this was emphasized the most under these terms, the culture wars were seen as a displacement of political economic agendas and the kind of favorite tool of the elite to manipulate gullible post-industrial electorates in the US, as somebody like Thomas Frank in his book, What's Wrong with Kansas, talks about that, the displacement of concerns with the economy to concerns to culture as a kind of manipulation of affect by political elites. You can maybe also compare the way affect situates the social or the socially produced as highly individual and also uncontrollable, while at the same time very exploitable. Am I running out of time? I'm good? Okay, let me know when I'm running out of time. So I guess theoretical orientations are often also thought about through the politics of affect. So you get sort of like references to pessimism, optimism, nihilism as descriptions for critical projects. I guess you could say like some examples I'm thinking of are Afro-pessimism or Black optimism or queer nihilism. And maybe these are projects more familiar within the US Academy. Critical projects that increasingly inform resistance movements against racism and patriarchy. At the same time, also with a kind of class politics try and reinvent themselves through categories of affect and its kind of self-explanatory claims to truth. One example would be the kind of new UK-based journal of political and cultural analysis, which is called Salvage, whose group of, I guess, coming from a libertarian socialist perspective. And they sort of they root their project in a kind of pessimism of the will. So reckoning with the hard work of reckoning with decades of defeat for progressive politics in the West and worldwide, or also the UK autonomous group Plan C. They're really using affect to kind of try and rethink like how to do politics, how to organize. So affect is seen both as a guide for developing a politics and as a lens for re-examining history, political history, from the standpoint of below or the margins. So that's speaking both in terms of power and the hierarchies of political rationality, when I say below or margins. So I guess the way kind of throughout sort of like leftist, socialist history, feminized and racialized subject positions have been seen as more emotional than rational. So thus affect is seen as redressing historical injustices like that and providing a language for communication across very different positions of advantage and interest on the left, but also people who don't situate themselves on the left. So affect is also seen as a way to reach people who are not politicized. But it also is seen as correcting something else, a kind of overemphasis by leftist movements or left formations on reason as against the kind of manipulative potential of focusing on emotion, which is seen as being part of a right-wing project. So again, it's kind of coming back to an Enlightenment perspective. So this emphasis on reason, on knowledge and critique as the forces of collective and individual emancipation, and the classic Enlightenment statement of that, of course, would be Immanuel Kant's injunction to abandon self-imposed immaturity and dare to question. These are now seen as the vulnerability of left politics, who really need to grapple with feeling instead. So I wonder if maybe I should sort of call it a day here. I've got more material, but it's getting quite long, I realize. And then sort of open it to clarification and discussion.